A policy analysis paper, or policy recommendation paper, is a very particular genre of writing that lays out the argument for a problem and the particular ways that that problem could or should be addressed by a particular stakeholder, who is understood to be, in this case, the client. A policy analysis paper has three basic parts. The first is the identification of the problem. The second is exploring the problem as policy. And the third is laying out a set of policy recommendations for the client. Identification of the problem, the first chapter, is usually the longest part. In many cases, the identification of the problem section is as long as the rest of the report. It takes up half of the total amount of pages. In this, you introduce the problem and identify it, explain who the stakeholders are, look at the current status of the problem and why the problem is important now, look at the history of the problem, how did we get to where we are now, and discuss some of the past attempts to deal with the problem and their successes and failures. The second part of the policy analysis is the problem as policy. Here the question is, what are the goals of your policy? What are the possible ways of meeting those goals? And in this case, you want to go into each option. You want to look at what kind of resources would be required to implement the option. You want to look at the feasibility of the option. That is, what kinds of political, economic, and social obstacles would occur in trying to implement a solution. There are a number of solutions, for example, that make very good sense in a purely practical way, but aren't politically feasible. And then you need to look at all of the foreseen consequences of each option that you can imagine. Once you've laid out all of the possible directions that policy options could go and what their various successes and failings are, then you get to the level where you begin to discuss the actual policy recommendations that you want to make. This is often the shortest part of the paper. Policy recommendations need to lay out how and why you chose the particular recommended alternatives that you did, lay out what course of action you recommend your clients to take, discuss strategies for implementing those courses of actions and what kinds of resources would be involved, and then finally works out a strategy for managing those problems and consequences that you can foresee coming out as a result of your policies. Later, when you do your policy briefing, you will follow roughly the same structure. So what I'd like you to do is think about the Kashmir insurgency policy briefing that I gave you at the beginning of the class, and look at how the components of that are laid out along the same lines as the policy analysis outline that's on your handout and that I just gave you here in this podcast. So to begin with, I had a kind of a hook. I showed that the Kashmir was once seen as a kind of paradise on earth, that it's no longer a paradise, it suffers human rights violations, and that it is a military flashpoint, and that it is a potential nuclear flashpoint. I then lay out my client's particular interests. What is it that my client wants through its policy implementations in this area? And I lay out three basic interests: avoidance of a nuclear exchange, reduction of the use of Kashmir by Islamic extremists, and reduction in violations of human rights by both Islamic militants and Indian security forces. I then go into an analysis of the problem itself. I talk about the geography of the region as it relates to the problem, the demographics of the population, and the history of the problem, how we got to where we are now, and how that plays into the situation that we have on hand. Having introduced that, I get to the players. I identify a set of key players: India, Pakistan, China, and Kashmiri insurgent groups, and I then talk about the roles that each one of them has in the particular policy analysis. Then we move on to what is the meat of Chapter 2. Here I lay out a set of policy principles. What is it that my client is going to use as a set of principles for weighing the different options that are available? I then lay out a number of options. I lay out 4 different scenarios, and for each one I talk about specific kinds of implementation problems that face trying to move forward with any of them. And then I get to my own preferred solution, the Andorra solution, and talk about how that would play out, what its advantages are, and then I go on to its disadvantages, that is, these foreseen consequences and problems. I then lay out a set of policy recommendations, and my policy recommendations do not impose the Andorra solution. They're not high-level things. They are geared specifically towards my client. That is, if my client accepts that the Andorra solution is the best way forward, what can my client, who in this case is the U.S. House of Representatives, what can it do to move this kind of policy forward? And those recommendations are very different than the recommendations I would give to the U.S. State Department if I were making the same doing the same general policy analysis for them. So this is the outline policy briefing generally follows. There are some modest differences here and there, but by and large, most policy analysis documents follow this kind of outline. And I think in this case you're going to strictly follow it, recognizing that as you unravel your particular problem, it may take different shape. There may be certain things that are longer, certain elements on this outline that are longer for your proposal than some of the other task force proposals, and others that you give less attention to. So the outline is meant to be flexible, but it's also meant to guide you through the steps that most professional policy analyses take. Hopefully you will find this useful, and we will have a good set of policy analyses by the time we finish the course.